I want to introduce Heather Erickson. Heather has been a member of MMS since 2018 and a member of the MMS Board since 2020. She is our Events and Fundraising chairperson, and she also serves as the editor of the quarterly newsletter, the Toadstool Review, which is a ton of work. And thank you so much, Heather, for working on that. I know you've done a ton of research on the history of MMS and Dr. Mary Whetstone. And you said while you were doing that research, you started to learn a lot about mycological societies in the United States in general. So again, it's a fitting time to sit back and hear about our history. And thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to share my screen here. And good evening, everyone. So tonight I'm going to talk about the historical significance of the MMS. And I'm going to touch on several topics related to the historical significance of the MMS, including the history of anti-foraging laws in the United States, how high-profile mushroom poisonings helped to spur the formation of mushroom clubs, the role the MMS and its foundress, Dr. Mary Whetstone, played in mycology in the early 1900s, more recent mushroom poisonings in Minnesota, the role the MMS plays with the Poison Control Center of Minnesota, and why foraging rights are essential for the MMS to continue to fulfill that role. Before we came to depend on agriculture for our sustenance, hunting and gathering were how we obtained food, medicine, and other essentials. Prior to independence, American colonists had broad rights to hunt, fish, and forage on public and private land, since they ensured the food supply for early colonists. Eventually, these rights came under attack due to racism, classism, imperialism, and tension during the birth of the nation. Indigenous groups were generally hunters and gatherers at this time. Even those that had implemented agricultural practices still depended on foraging for their survival. Once colonists began sweeping across America, settlers pushed indigenous tribes off of their land and armed themselves with guns to defend their newly stolen property. Those without land were unable to get food, medicine, and materials as they had in the past. During chattel slavery in America, enslaved Black people often foraged to supplement the paltry meals provided by plantation owners. After the Civil War, many freed Black people earned a living selling foods they foraged from unoccupied lands. Soon, however, Southern states began to systematically restrict foraging rights and the practices of the newly freed Black people. The government historically sided with the expanding concept of limiting land rights to the commons, especially since only landowners had the right to vote, so they were the people who made the rules. And eventually, property laws enabled those who owned land to forbid foraging, and this became the norm across the nation. Anti-foraging laws also targeted rural white farmers who would hunt and gather plants for food and medicine. One example is that of subsistence farmers in the Adirondack region of New York. They used to forage for berries and herbs like ginseng as an integral part of the local economy in the 1800s. Then a push to protect the land came from outside elites who wanted to keep the land for themselves and cut rural populations off from their self-sufficiency. This did have two effects. While it raised awareness among white people of the importance of conservation, over the years, Americans began to lose touch with knowledge of the land. Mushrooms in particular were mysterious and had negative associations in the minds of many people who feared their unknown properties. I'm sure that you've met people who looked at you like you're crazy for venturing into the woods for your next meal. They fear wild mushrooms and the potentially deadly results of eating the wrong one. If it isn't a button mushroom sliced up and delivered on a pizza, they'll pass. So how people feel about mushrooms has a lot to do with culture. And having a culture that fears mushrooms means that the people in it not only miss out on the fantastic benefits that fungi have to offer, but there isn't enough education about identification. And so those who do become adventurous without proper guidance are at real risk for putting the wrong mushroom on their plate and the plates of their loved ones. But lately, interest in foraging has been booming. New mushroom clubs are popping up all over the country, and existing clubs are experiencing a surge in membership. Part of this can be attributed to what we're learning about the benefits that fungi have to offer. The film Fantastic Fungi helped raise awareness of fungi's roles in our lives and our planet. And we can't discount the role that the pandemic played in sparking renewed interest in the outdoors. People needed something to do outside of their homes, and the ability to slow down and search for these beneficial treasures was just what many people needed. Now they're hooked and they're telling their friends. At least that's what I did. But this isn't the first time that foods from the forest have experienced a cultural revival in the United States. Mycophagy, or cooking with mushrooms, became a topic of interest during the Civil War, with magazine articles touting fungi as a great addition to the table. And as novices began to explore and become poisoned, it became clear that what was needed was instruction on how to identify toxic versus tasty mushrooms. So in the 1890s, books and reports on the subject were published, and the first mushroom clubs were organized in Washington, Boston, and Philadelphia. This is also when the first modern mycologists arose, including Thomas Taylor, William Hamilton Gibson, Dr. Charles Horton Peck, Julius Avenel Palmer, and Charles McIlvaine. And we'll hear some of these names again during my presentation. At that time in the United States, the two main places for the public to get mycological knowledge were Albany, New York, and Washington, D.C. D.C. in particular was an early hotspot for mushroom foraging. One D.C. resident was Count Mycology. He had a personal servant named Chung Yu-ting. Chung was a multi-talented, multilingual, highly regarded man in the community. One day, he returned home with a bushel load of mushrooms that he had found growing in nearby Bethesda Park, near the ruins of a hotel fire. The Mycology family was concerned about the safety of these mushrooms and tried to convince Chung to destroy them. But he was confident that he knew what they were, so he ate a big dish of them and he sent packages of them to several of his housekeeping friends. Later that evening, the Count found Chung in intense agony. Chung died 4 days later. Prior to dying, he was able to give the Count the addresses of his friends to whom he had sent the mushrooms, and so thankfully they were spared. Thomas Taylor, a mycologist at the USDA, later identified the mushrooms from these packages as Amanita phalloides, or the death cap. The death cap looks like the Asian straw mushroom and other common Asian varieties of edible Amanita species, such as Amanita princeps. Death caps contain a high concentration of compounds called amatoxins. The death cap mushrooms are poisonous regardless of how they're prepared. You cannot remove the poison from them in any way. The symptoms of death cap poisoning appear in 3 phases. The first is the gastrointestinal phase, and this stage of mushroom poisoning usually happens about 6 to 24 hours after eating the mushroom. And the typical symptoms during this stage include nausea and vomiting, bloody diarrhea or urine, abdominal pain, fluid loss, dehydration, and electrolyte imbalance from all of the above, and fever. And then after about 12 to 36 hours, that first wave of symptoms will pass and the patient begins to feel much better. This is called the latent phase. And during this stage, the toxins of the mushroom are still affecting the body, even though you don't feel it. They're beginning to damage your liver and your kidneys. That's when the person would enter the third and final stage, which is called the hepatorenal phase. And this is the stage where the liver and the kidneys are so damaged that they actually begin to shut down. And this period is very, very dangerous and would require extreme medical intervention. At this point, the patient would have loss of liver and kidney function, jaundice, low blood sugar, and delirium and confusion. There are treatments with varying degrees of success. If someone eats a death cap, it's essential that you would get medical help immediately. But unfortunately, during Chung's time, his lifetime, there was no treatment. And that's why he died. His last words to the Countess Mycological on October 17th of 1894 were, "I disobeyed for once, and therefore I must die. Goodbye." This story, reported in the Washington Post and other local papers, shocked the community. So it was fresh in their memories just 3 years later when the city was struck by another blow due to misidentifying mushrooms. This tragedy involved Count Achilles d'Ebec. D'Ebec was known for personally delivering a letter of support for the Union to President Abraham Lincoln. Then he entered the Civil War to lead the 9th Massachusetts Artillery, known as D'Ebec's Battery. He was later wounded and settled in the United States as a member of the Italian Diplomatic Corps. He had a reputation for being cultivated and refined and prided himself on his knowledge of mushrooms. In 1897, you could purchase fresh wild mushrooms in Washington, D.C. from African American women at the K Street Market. These women collected them from nearby woods and fields and sold them alongside of their vegetables. But there was another vendor selling at the market, a man named John Bowes, and he was not known for selling mushrooms. But one day, Count d'Ebec spoke with him at the market and asked him if he would collect a basket full of Amanita caesarea, a delicious mushroom that some people even eat raw. When Bowes delivered the basket of mushrooms to him, the Count performed some chemical tests and he noted that their stems didn't blacken when cut. Then on the morning of November 9th, 1897, the Count and his housemate, Dr. Daniel J. Kelly, sat down for breakfast and ate platefuls of the mushrooms. And they both declared them to be the finest mushrooms that they had ever eaten. The doctor then went to the U.S. Patent Office, where he worked as an assistant examiner. There, he fell into a stupor. He became incoherent and disoriented at his desk. Colleagues noticed this, and they immediately took him to the hospital, where thankfully he recovered soon after. Unfortunately, the Count had several health problems already, so he didn't fare as well. Dr. Kelly's wife tried to give him an emetic to induce vomiting, but he refused it. He fell prostrate, became blind, and within 2 hours lapsed into unconsciousness. His physician injected him with apomorphine and atropine to no avail. The Count seized and convulsed to the point of breaking the bed. He fell into a coma and he died the next day. The USDA wanted to protect the public, and so an investigation was launched, not only into the death of the Count, but the mushrooms themselves. It was discovered that the mushrooms were not Amanita caesarea, they were Amanita muscaria. The symptoms of Amanita muscaria poisoning generally include confusion, dizziness, and fatigue, and visual and auditory perceptual changes. So like hallucinations. Gastroenteric symptoms are generally uncommon, but they can happen. And severe poisoning can result in coma, as we saw with the Count. And in rare cases, circulatory and respiratory failure can occur, leading to death. One thing was very clear to investigators. The African American women selling mushrooms at the K Street Market were, as USDA botanist Frederick Colville described them, not only experts at identification, but also very responsible vendors. They limited what they offered to 4 common edibles, selling only Agaricus campestris, the common mushroom, Agaricus arvensis, the horse mushroom, Coprinus comatus, the shaggy mane, and Lycoperdon cyathiform, the puffball. If the problem wasn't due to any failure of public health, civil ordinance, or market practice, then how could poisonings like those of Chung and Divik be prevented in the future? Education. This is when mycologists, both professional and amateur, really stepped up to the plate. And it's also where we encounter a young Dr. Mary Whetstone. When Mary Whetstone arrived in Minnesota in 1882, she was the second female physician in Minneapolis. In those early years, she focused on her medical practice and improving conditions of care for women and children. I did a presentation on Dr. Whetstone in September of 2021. If you're interested in learning more about her amazing contributions to our healthcare system, you can find that video on the MMS YouTube channel. One of the things that she firmly believed was that diet, cleanliness, and rest were essential to the health of her patients. So she started to look for alternative sources of nutrition for the women and children in her care. And this is what first sparked her interest in mycology. On November 3rd of 1898, only a year after Count Divik died of mushroom poisoning, Mary Whetstone sent a letter along with 9 mushrooms collected by MMS club members to a mycologist, Dr. Charles Horton Peck in Albany, New York. Each mushroom was accompanied by a fungi memorandum, or what we would today call a collection slip. These tell the recipient where and when the specimens were found, under what conditions they were growing, and how they appeared when fresh. In her letter, she writes, "We organized a mushroom club about October 11th. We have 20 enthusiastic, intelligent members. Except Miss Flint of St. Paul, none of us knows much, and we have no specialist here to aid us. May we send you specimens for classification when we are able to name them? We have Hayes' Fungus Hunter's Guide, Michelvain's Key, Sacchardochromatexia, and have ordered Massey. Can you name any or send anything else to us to aid us in the study of mushrooms? What would you suggest for us to do in the winter months to continue the study and interest? For the present, we shall continue to meet every Monday. I have the honor to be president and Miss L. Flint, secretary." The Minnesota Mycological Society was incorporated in 1899, and it has been in continuous existence ever since, making it the second oldest mycological society in North America. What is particularly interesting is that the club was started by people that really knew nothing about mushrooms. And within a matter of years, they had educated themselves with the aid of Dr. Peck and the publications that they purchased. And by 1911, Dr. Whetstone was considered to be the leading authority on fleshy fungi in the region. Today, her collections can still be found at the New York State Museum in Albany and as part of the C.G. Lloyd Collection, also known as the National Fungus Collection. Over the years, Mary Whetstone continued to correspond with nationally known mycologists, seeking their help in identification and scientific advice. Through these letters, we see that many of the club's activities look much like they do today, from identification meetings to state fair displays to experimenting with cultivation. But another activity that doesn't get talked about a lot, but is nonetheless essential to our community, is that of working with physicians after a suspected mushroom poisoning. From the beginning of the MMS, doctors would write to Dr. Whetstone inquiring about which mushroom could have poisoned their patient. These inquiries were taken very seriously and were an important part of the club's scientific purpose and service to the community. In October of 1911, Dr. Whetstone wrote to Dr. Peck about a family from New Ulm that had eaten poisonous mushrooms. He responds immediately, concerned that she may actually try the mushroom herself in an effort to figure out what they were. This is something that some mycologists did back then. Because we don't have her letter to Dr. Peck, we don't know how Dr. Whetstone determined that this mushroom was not suitable for consumption, but we do have his response to her. October 31st, 1911, Dr. Peck writes, Dear Mrs. Whetstone, your letter of October 27th was intensely interesting to me. Your experience with number 3, though grievous to you, will be a most important addition to our knowledge of this species, and possibly save others from incurring the danger of eating it. If I can get specimens of it here, I will have it analyzed and publish it as a deleterious species. I thank you most cordially for your letter, and I am glad that your experiment was no worse. It was bad enough as it was. Very truly yours, Charles H. Peck. Today, when a person or a pet ingests a potentially poisonous mushroom, time is of the essence, and accuracy in identifying the mushroom is essential. The pet will go to a vet, and a person may go to their local ER, but their medical providers aren't typically experts in fungal identification. So they call the Minnesota Poison Control. When it's a particularly tricky mushroom to identify, like a suspected destroying angel, Amanita bisporgera, I can't say the name, then the Minnesota Poison Control will reach out to the MMS. MMS member Ron Spinoza has over 30 years of experience identifying mushrooms, and for the last 20 years, he has been an identifier for our local poison control center. He gets frequent calls during the mushroom season. Ron says that with decent photos, an identifier should be able to ID mushrooms to the level of genus and also be familiar with the symptoms of the various mushroom toxins. In addition to Ron's years of experience, he has a large collection of field guides to reference, and he consults reputable internet sites as resources. Deadly mushrooms in Minnesota include the destroying angel, the deadly gallerina, and the death cap. There are also some false morels in the genus Gyromitra that have occasionally caused fatalities. Other dangerously poisonous mushrooms include the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, the green gill mushroom, the fly agaric mushroom, muscarine-containing mushrooms in the genera Clatosabe and Anasabe, orange cortinaria species that can cause renal failure, and local toxic species in the genus Agaricus. Because edible mushrooms from one place may have toxic lookalikes somewhere else, immigrants who foraged in their homeland sometimes misidentify mushrooms to their peril. In 2018, a Burmese man gathered some mushrooms near his workplace. It was his first time foraging since arriving in Minnesota in 2015. But these mushrooms resembled the ochre mushroom, Amanita hemibatha variation ochracea, commonly known as the half-dyed slender Caesar, from his native Burma. He brought the mushrooms home, cooked them in turmeric, oil, and water, and shared them with his daughter, who ate a much smaller portion than he did. Within 2 to 3 hours of eating the mushrooms, he was at the emergency room in an altered mental state. He had vomiting, diarrhea, incontinence, sweating, excessive salivation, and swollen lips and tongue. Acute respiratory failure developed quickly. He was admitted, intubated, and placed on a mechanical ventilator for 4 days. In all, his hospital stay was 8 days long. The man's daughter had similar symptoms, but much, much milder. She was admitted to the hospital overnight for observation and discharged the following day. An emergency room doctor recognized the man's symptoms as likely being cholinergic mushroom toxosis, and he notified the Minnesota Poison Control System. Poison control officials contacted the state health department, and this began an investigation that included work by the Minnesota Mycological Society, which was pivotal in confirming which variety of poisonous mushroom was involved. The research team interviewed the patient through an interpreter, and he told them how and where he had collected the mushrooms. Investigators went to the site where the mushrooms were picked and found one remaining mushroom which matched the patient's description. Ron Spinoza examined the mushroom and identified it as Amanita muscaria variation Gasawi. In September of 2006, 7 people from 2 families in the Hmong community were hospitalized after eating mushrooms picked by a relative in St. Paul's Keller-Phelan Regional Park. They looked similar to the edible ones that grow in abundance in Southeast Asia. In that case, the emergency room sent one of the mushrooms to Ron Spinoza's apartment in a taxi for identification. The mushroom was not in very good shape, but he was able to recognize it as a destroying angel. With that mushroom, the elderly and the young are more susceptible to the deadly effects. The first phase of destroying angel poisoning consists of diarrhea and vomiting. This phase may end within a few hours, creating a false sense of security while the toxins damage the organs. Then the second phase may happen after a day or two, and that's when you feel you've recovered from the mushroom poisoning, but the toxin-mediated damage to vital organs occurs, and that's when your organs start shutting down. While 6 of the 7 family members recovered, 10-year-old Selena Thao remained in the hospital until she died at 10 a.m. on September 15th. Her uncle, Chow Li, said her body couldn't take the toxins. From January to October of 2023, America's poison centers have received more than 7,250 calls about potential mushroom poisonings. This is an 11% increase from all of 2022, when there were about 6,500 calls for the entire year. While immigrants are at risk for mistaking poisonous mushrooms for the tasty ones in their country of origin, there is another reason that mushroom poisonings have surged. People who haven't been properly trained to identify mushrooms are relying on technology to do the work for them. While an app may help point a person to the right direction as they begin to investigate which mushroom they're looking at, they can't feel the mushroom or look at its surroundings, smell it, or take a spore print. Mushrooms are living beings and they change quickly over their lifetime. So 2 mushrooms of the same type side by side can actually look quite different from each other. The quality of information that you give an app will greatly affect the accuracy of its ID. While apps like iNaturalist can be very helpful for cataloging mushroom sightings and even narrow down what a mushroom might be, they should never be relied upon completely to determine the edibility of an unknown mushroom. Recently, CNN did a story on Bill Hickman, an Ohio man who took a picture of a mushroom in his yard. The app on his phone said it was a giant puffball. Instead, he had found destroying angel eggs. One is enough to kill a man, and he ate 4 of them. He was given an experimental antidote made from milk thistle extract. They needed to deliver it quickly to counter the effects of the toxin on the liver. This treatment helps about 30 to 50% of patients, but it isn't widely available at this time. Bill got a tattoo to commemorate where the antidote was administered, and he's decided to limit his future interactions with mushrooms to photographing them. Foraging rights are essential to the MMS and our community. In the beginning of my presentation, I talked about anti-foraging laws. There are currently efforts underway to restrict foraging on state property, which is of great concern since foraging rights are essential to the mission of the MMS. But what do foraging rights have to do with mushroom poisonings? Some people might think that foraging is the problem. But the fact is, people will always seek out nature and her bounty. Just as we learned 125 years ago, education is crucial. Not only is it important for people to have the opportunity to learn how to accurately identify mushrooms in the field with experienced mycologists, we also perform the essential task of identifying mushrooms for the Poison Control Center when someone eats the wrong mushroom and their life is in peril. Ron Spinoza didn't go to school to learn about mushrooms. Like Mary Whetstone, he learned about them as a member of the MMS. Ron is now in his 80s. Who will the next mushroom identifiers be? How can we train people to know the difference between poisonous and edible mushrooms when we aren't allowed to pick anything but edible? I recall one of the first forays I went on with the MMS. Ron was the educator, and like we do at the end of every foray, we laid out the various mushrooms that we had found, and Ron picked up 2 different mushrooms that looked quite similar, but had some notable differences that he explained. One was a chanterelle, a choice edible that has become one of my favorites, and the other was a jack-o'-lantern. While not lethal, eating the jack-o'-lantern will result in severe cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea. Ron showed the 2 mushrooms side by side and explained how to know in the field which one is safe to put in your basket. It was a valuable lesson, and one that's much more difficult to teach due to foraging restrictions that no longer allow us to pick non-edible mushrooms on state land. Lately, the proposed bag limits on foraging has been in the news a lot because it would have a profound negative effect on many Minnesotans who rely on foraging for their food and their cultural way of life. But what isn't in the news is the effect that the totality of the restrictions on foraging would have on science, environmental understanding, and the body of knowledge that enables a hospital to send a mushroom to an MMS member via taxi and save the lives of 6 people in St. Paul, Minnesota. The MMS does far more for our community than most people realize. This is why we've continued to thrive for 125 years, and why I hope we continue to thrive for at least 125 more. Thank you very much.
Oh, I got a question. Hey,
Mhm.
how long was Dr. Mary Whetstone was the president? I think you did 1911. Did she like serve for a long time or what?
She didn't stay president the whole time that she was in the club. In fact, when she died, she was, I believe she was corresponding secretary for the club. So, she played different roles in the club throughout her life, but she lived up until I believe she was about 80 when she died, and
Mm.
she remained a very active member of the club right up until her death. So,
Okay, thanks.
mhm.
Leah, Charles is asking if Ron is the only one who does the ID for poison control. And, we were actually just chatting about this a bit before the meeting because we had a request from, Heather, remind me who the request was from. Was it from poison control or was it the Department of Health? Yep.
Yeah.
We talked about that. We thought Anna Garanday used to also do it. And I think they were also interested in us sort of thinking about who else we might be able to offer to kind of add to that list.
And
Oh,
John
I
has
don't
all.
know. Maybe someone who wrote a book that we all use in the field
Yeah.
constantly.
Yes. Could be Kathy.
Yeah, gosh, that's just a guess.
Yeah.
And John has volunteered to
Yeah,
add
yep,
names to that
John.
list. Mm-hmm.
Judy's saying it'd be good to send a link to this recording to the DNR and state representatives and senators. I think that is an amazing idea. I love how the history has kind of come full circle and is coming back, and a lot of the same concerns 125 years ago are happening now. It's like the answer isn't to just shut it all down. The answer is to learn more.
Mhm. And especially with the world becoming a smaller place, so now next month, now Ron is currently in Italy, so we're all very jealous. But he's currently in Italy, and next month he will be back. And Ron and Aaron Berg and myself, we all went to Mexico together. And that was one of the things we talked about. I don't mean the three of us, but when we went down to the Nama regional foray in Mexico, they talked about that a lot, about how there are mushrooms you can eat down there that look like mushrooms that we eat up here. And you don't necessarily want to come back home and say, oh, well, I ate that in Mexico, so I can eat that in Minnesota, because it's different. They're different. And so we've heard that, when you travel, whether it's because of the environment itself or because of look-alike mushrooms that are in fact different. It was interesting that Burmese man who was poisoned more recently, he was thinking the exact same thing that the man who bought the mushrooms for Count Dubik thought. They both got Amanita muscaria, and they were both looking for Amanita caesarea. So it's not like it's a crazy thing to make a mistake doing. It can happen because mushrooms are weird. They don't always look like those pretty pictorial things that we see with the white dots on them, and they just they can fool you. So it is really important to have extra caution around anything that isn't one of like what we call the safe six or the foolproof four. So yeah.
Especially when they're really young.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's like when I hear this story, the only thing I can think of from seeing both mushrooms side by side in Mexico, and we'll talk more about it next month.
Mm-hmm.
The only way they could have mixed those up is honestly if they were really young.
Yeah.
I believe it.
Yeah.
Or didn't know what to look at. I think that's some of the education, right? Is like when you just take a quick glance, you think you're seeing, oh, I've got color and shape, but there's so much more to it.
There are so many things in the chat. There are certain tests that can be made. And this is John Lamprecht. I'm just kind of chiming in a little bit here too, because there are tests that are out there for certain of the toxins, but some of the toxins, the tests are still in process. There is so much we have to learn. This is part of the concern of what I have as a foray chair and a foray. And when we're laying out our forays, it would be nice to just say, we're just going to go out and pick chanterelles. But there's so many other things that we see out there that you need to learn. And when we find those learning opportunities, we feel compelled to teach, because if you see an Amanita egg and you see how to tell it's an Amanita egg, I might be saving your life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, we don't want to take that. We don't want to take that lightly. So please understand, sometimes we might be getting a little too verbose about, going on about this and that. But there's a reason for it. And Heather did a fabulous job. Incredible job.
Thanks.
This is Howard. I just want to add that this is one more reason for the annual photo contest, and that you document what your findings are throughout the year. And we've got Ron, John, identifiers when needed. And it's a great learning experience for all of our members to see the great diversity of mushrooms that are out there. And Nan, I don't know if you have the numbers tallied yet, but it'd be interesting to hear how many varieties we've documented this year.
Yeah, this year we had 249 different submissions across all three categories. And so pictorial, out of the 157 submitted, there were a couple that we weren't clear on identification, and a couple we had the genus but not the species. But I believe we had 114 different species just in pictorial. And scientific, we had 30 submissions. We had 39 species because some of them have more than one species in the submission. And even out of the other and the humor, there were 62 submissions and we had 44 different species. So that's kind of fun. And even within the genus, like the most frequently photographed genus would be like the Amanita, where we had 21 submissions, but we still had about 8 or 9 different species within the Amanita. And same with Mycena, we had a lot of photos there, but we also had like 6 different species even in that 11. So we had a huge variety this year.